Good evening and welcome to another session of our Christian formation at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Greensboro, Alabama. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can go to the description and get a link to Father Trey's Thoughts.blogspot.com, where you'll be able to follow along with the session with the outline for it on there. If you're on SoundCloud listening to this or on iTunes podcast, same thing. You can look at the description. That'll give you the exact link to get to where the outline is on Father Trey's Thoughts.blogspot.com. So tonight's session is about the daily office in Scripture. So just to kind of recap what we've been talking about for the past month on this subject, we started out with the academic side of things by looking at study Bibles and the various ones that are out there and the various things to look for when you're looking for a study Bible that's right for you. Last week we focused on methods to help you with your own personal connection with Scripture. So to help you to hear what God is saying to you right now in this moment. And you'll be able to follow links to both of those classes through the outline. Now, we have a specific tool in the Episcopal Church and in the wider Anglican tradition that helps us to be able to hear, listen, and read Scripture. And it's built in really to our framework because it comes in our Book of Common Prayer. And specifically, this is through what's called the daily office. So just to give you a little bit of context for this, what is the daily office? Well, the daily office is a set of services for prayer throughout the day. This comes from early Christianity, early in our history, and these services would have been full of prayer and of Scripture. And after time, they got to be more and more complicated and more long. So what Cranmer did when he was compiling the Book of Common Prayer is took these ancient forms and ancient ideas, and there were many different hours of the day you could do prayers for the daily office. He condensed it down into morning and evening prayer and then shortened those services as well. So when most people are maybe a little bit more familiar with morning and evening prayer, at least in the Episcopal Church. When you hear daily office, those are the primary services for that, is morning and evening prayer. Now, there may be scholars out there who disagree with me on this, but I would say that Cranmer's point and his approach in the daily office with morning and evening prayer was to be not only evangelical, but to specifically be evangelical through Scripture, to really get people to be listening to Scripture and understand what Scripture was saying. And you could argue with this, but here's my reasons for thinking that. He makes very clear in the preface for his prayer book that the Bible is at the center of the worship. And in fact, he even goes on to say that his hope in the people listening to Scripture is that they would be stirred up to godliness. The other is the insistence on the use of English as the language, not just in Scripture, but in the entire service. Because this would have been the language that people understood, and oftentimes at this point in history, service would have been in Latin. They wouldn't have been in the language spoken by the vast majority of the people. We also see the Bible being used as a tool of evangelism and service by Cranmer in the prayer book because the idea, as he lays out in his preface, is that the whole Bible would be read, not in one sitting, but that in his approach and in his way of setting these services up and setting up the readings for these services, the idea is that we would read the Bible as a whole. So we would get all of Scripture throughout going to these services each and every day. And finally, I think we see this idea of evangelism focused on Scripture through the ringing of the bell. And this was my recent faith fact that I did. What Cranmer called for, so in England in his time and still today, the curates and clergy are required to say morning and evening prayer each day. But the idea that Cranmer laid out is that the curate, so that would be the new priests who are still in training, that they would go and ring the bell for the church, and that would let people know, hey, morning prayer is starting, evening prayer is starting, come and join us. And the idea is that people would hear this and say, oh, hey, I better go and see what's going on there. And then, of course, because Scripture is such a big part of morning and evening prayer, by letting them know when those services are going on, the hope is that people would come and then they would hear the Scripture through those services. Now, let's fast forward to today and how we look at morning and evening prayer today. I think it's important for us to note, first off, that our way of service is very similar to what Cranmer would have done in his day. As far as morning and evening prayer go in particular. So we're really, when we're praying these services, when we're worshiping in this way, we're praying the way that people have since Cranmer's time, and really before then, since much of Cranmer's work was based on the works of others before him. So our service of morning and evening prayer, like those services, is really about combining prayer with our reading of Scripture. And I think this can be very important because it gets at the fact that this is a conversation. God isn't just speaking to us, but praying after we read the Scripture gives us a chance to respond to what God is saying to us. So it's conversation, and it reminds us that we are very much in relationship with God. Now, one of the great things about morning and evening prayer is that there's a lectionary that goes with it. So you don't just have to figure out for yourself what to read. There's specific readings for each day of the year. And you can find that lectionary here in the prayer book. And this is on page 935 right here, 935. 934, 935 is where it starts. Basically this will give you for each day an Old and New Testament, as well as, an Old Testament and a New Testament as far as the epistle, and then a reading from one of the Gospels as well, and then there's selections from the Psalms too. So the idea of that, this is on a 2-year cycle. You can see this from the next page. We've got year 1 on the one side, down here, and then we've got year 2 on another side, down here. And so we've got readings for each of those, and the idea is that that gives us a way to read the vast majority of Scripture in the course of 2 years' time. You can space out the readings, and that concerning I showed you before, that lays out the ways in which you can do that. So you could, if you're doing morning and evening prayer, it gives you a way to read all 3 of the readings. You could read 2 at morning prayer and 1 at evening prayer. So that's what the prayer book lines out for you. And of course, you've got options there too. The prayer book is nice about that, to give you lots of options. Another great thing, and another good reason for using the morning and evening prayer to frame your reading of Scripture is it gives you consistency. It helps you to get through Scripture in that 2-year cycle, but it gives you consistency in doing it. The idea is that you're saying these prayers each and every day, that you're doing these services at these times of the day every single day. That's what it's designed for. And you don't have to go to your local church to do that, because not all Episcopal churches will have a morning and evening prayer service set for everyone to go to. You can do these services on your own. You don't need a clergy to officiate these services either. The officiant in these services is a layperson too. And there's certain differences between having a clergy and lay-led service for this that is outlined in the service as well. But anyone can lead it. You can do it on your own. You can do it with a group. That's the nice thing about that too. Now, with the 1979 prayer book that is the current prayer book that we use in the Episcopal Church, so in our part of the Anglican Communion, there have been, the daily office has been a little bit extended. So it's not just the traditional Anglican morning and evening prayer. Now we also have afternoon day prayer, noonday prayer, and Compline. So noonday prayer, that's pretty easy to figure out what that is. That's prayer that you do at noontime. And there's beautiful prayers intended for that too, particularly reminding us of Jesus' death on the cross at noon. There's also Compline, and Compline is meant for later in the evening. It can also be a prayer that you do right before you go to bed. Now, both of these services you can use in addition to morning and evening prayer if you so choose. They offer shorter readings, but there's what we call a rubric, a little instruction. It'll be there in the italics that you'll see in the service, and they have very, very short scripture passages, 1 or 2 lines, verses really, for those. They say that you can add an appropriate scripture. So if you would like to read noonday prayer or Compline and use that to get your scripture in, you can use the lectionary readings with those services, which is a nice thing as well. And now I'm going to do one last show and tell here. And this is going to be for the daily devotions for individuals and families. And this is on page 136 in the Book of Common Prayer. So you'll see that down here, 136, right here. So, and I show this because it's probably something that many of you may not be as familiar with. I wasn't familiar with it until many, many years down the road of my growing up in the Episcopal Church. The nice thing about these, they're basically shorter versions of the entire the entire daily office. And as it says, they're for individuals or families. And we live in a very busy world. Not everybody is going to have time to sit down and do every single prayer, canticle, collect that you could possibly do for morning and evening prayer. This shortens it. You get shorter prayers, you get fewer of them, you get lots more options too. And just like with noonday prayer and Compline, you can substitute lectionary readings for their shorter ones as well, which is a nice thing to do. So if you don't have the time to sit and do morning and evening prayer yourself, but you still want to have that prayer to frame your reading, your daily reading of Scripture, this is a way to do it. With these prayers for individuals and families, these daily devotions, that's a way that you can do it in the time that you have and need. So, again, you can frame that in with the lectionary, so you can follow along with that lectionary as well. You don't have to do all the readings in the lectionary. You could choose to do just the gospel for 1 or 2 years and then go on to the Old Testament or the epistles. Now, what I've done here is to try to frame how our prayer book in the Episcopal Church gives you ways, gives you a built-in tool to use to help you read Scripture daily. And I hope that will be helpful. This may not be what everybody needs. Not everybody will be drawn to this method. And that's okay too. The point of this is to use this method so that you feel closer to God and so that you're able to read Scripture more fully. But if you need to adapt this too, that's fine. If morning and evening prayer doesn't work for you, but noonday prayer or Compline or both does, use that instead. If these daily devotions are what you need, use that. But the point is just to give you another tool that you can use to help with your own daily reading of Scripture. So thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. Join us in a couple of weeks as we continue on with our Christian formation. And you can go on to fathertrey'sthoughts.blogspot.com not only for this session, but for other Christian formation sessions and sermons and all other kinds of things there. So thank you again for joining us. Hope you have a pleasant evening.